Greetings to all of you who have joined us. This is the SAPES Trust Policy Dialogue Forum on StreamYard, YouTube. Today, we are hosting the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, who are presenting a program, a very important program, to honor Women's Month. And the title is very appropriate, Amplifying the Voices of Women of Fortitude. We're very grateful to the panel, the moderator, Zukiswa, and the panelists, and in particular, the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, for agreeing to partner us in this very important venture today. So without much ado, I'm going to introduce the moderator, Zukiswa Wana, who is truly a Southern African, in that she has a mother hails from this part of the world called Zimbabwe. So Mwana Wedu. So Zukiswi, what they call you?
Zukiswa.
So it's to you now. You take over for the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Perhaps a fitting, obviously, way to get into the conversation was just listening to that music from Frank Bukaka and I Hear Africa, because we are currently undergoing quite a lot of problems, and I will start this conversation by bringing in Retabile Ratomo from the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. And she is an advocate for social justice, youth empowerment, and legal advocacy. As program manager of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, she has led national campaigns to promote civic participation to promote civic participation. So I'm going to start with you, Retabile. Somebody comes to you and they say, "Women of Fortitude, we think Jacinta Ngobese Zuma is a woman of fortitude." Your response?
Well, I mean, when we had an event, right, named the Women of Fortitude, sorry, let me just greet everyone and thank you so much to SAPES as well for this partnership. We're very excited to be here to have this conversation. I think that's such an interesting question, what a provocative question, right? But when we think of Women of Fortitude, to us, the pioneers of that are the women who led the 1956 Women's March. And those are the women of fortitude who we like to uplift within the foundation, women who are fighting for the dignity of women across South Africa, across Africa, women who in their own right are making a difference within their communities. Some may say that is Jacinta, but I think what we're seeing happen through, March and March's actions and fellow groupings is an attack on human dignity. And I think it's important that when we want to uplift human dignity, what we uplift is the positive people, the positive aspects, not things that are causing divisions within our society currently.
Thank you very much for that. They had, one of the things that you do is promoting civic participation amongst the youth. And yet we're also getting conversation from the youth that say, well, we're not going to vote anyway, it's not going to change. How do you maneuver that conversation, and what have you been doing in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult conversation, right? Because we do see across the continent, just not just in South Africa, right? But we see a lack of participation by young people. And through, one of our key programs at the foundation, our youth activism and leadership program, we really try to encourage young people to be involved in the communities that they occupy. So with that, we go into communities, we identify young leaders, and it's important that they are the solution creators to their own problems within society, not just in their communities, but that they're able to input. So we really, as a grassroots organization, take that approach very seriously, making sure that young people firstly are aware of what's happening in society around them, but also that they have the confidence to actually be able to contribute. Fortitude. And obviously that comes hand in hand with also promoting civic participation and making sure that young people across South Africa are aware of their power in being able to either vote, whether it's through public participation processes, submitting comments for public policy. All those different aspects are things that we highlight throughout our programs.
Thank you very much. Eleanor, you are director of Puku Foundation, and one of the things that you're really big on for a very long time is bringing literacy to young people. And, in my experience, I actually went as an observer and really wearing my hat as a writer and a journalist. I have seen young children running along with March and March during those protests. What do you tell these young people? What do you tell them about the interreliability with the rest of the continent and the history? And is there like a deliberate plan for promoting illiteracy so that people don't question, so that kids don't question?
Yes, this has really bothered me. I try as much as I can to look through the eyes of children as the director of the Children's Literature Foundation, and what is good for children and what is bad for children. And one of the things, we've been brought up in the liberation struggle, equity, diversity, tolerance, the bywords. We realize how important on this continent it is to be able to operate multilingually and multiculturally. It's a big disadvantage to not be able to get on with other people. And it has been really a sobering issue for me that you have adults marching to remove other Africans, fellow Africans, saying, they must get out, all of them. What does this say for children? What does this do for children's competence in schools in just dealing with difference? I went to school in West Africa. I did a postgraduate diploma in West Africa. And it was one of my most enriching experiences in my life to be studying with Africans from all over the continent. And it worries me that South African children are not given that exposure. So a South African child doesn't read about a child from Zimbabwe or Zambia or Ghana or Nigeria. They just don't have that exposure. And it's like almost March on March or Magahambe are saying they must go, we don't want them, we don't want to know anything about them. And, they say curiosity killed the cat. And I actually say it's the opposite. If you are not curious about other people, even about people who are doing negative things, if you are not curious, you won't find out and you won't learn. You won't learn what their motivations are, and you won't learn how to problem solve if you are not curious. So that's a major concern of mine.
So how do we go, against this? We are in communities, but we're not in communities. So when you see children being taken to these protests, to these marches, when you then, and I'm glad that we're rightly just calling it Afrophobia and not xenophobia, because it's our fellow Africans that we are most affecting. But we've also seen situations where South Africans who are considered too dark to be have been on the receiving end of these attacks. What happens in that? What is the colorism, and what should we have learned from history? Eleanor, and perhaps you too, Retabile, you can jump on this.
I'm going to hand over to Retabile. The Ahmed Kathrada Foundation makes a whole week, anti-racism week, and emphasizes this and works with many young people in communities. So, she can talk about that. And I think as part of anti-racism week has to expand to, well, it is, it's funny to say racism because it's black on black violence, actually. That's what it is. So you can't call it racism in that way. But I think let me hand over to her and then I can comment afterwards on that.
Sure. Thank you so much, Eleanor, for the opportunity. I think one thing that you've highlighted, right, is Anti-Racism Week. And one thing that we emphasize in Anti-Racism Week, but just in general, when we're speaking about the issue of racism, is the fact that, discrimination based on nationality forms part of that definition. So for us, the conversation about Afrophobia, racism, xenophobia, tribalism forms all part and package of the definition of racism. So it's important for us to highlight that. And we find creative ways also to have this conversation with young people. I mean, recently this year on June 16, part of the foundation's 50 activations across our youth clubs included screenings of a short film produced by Sanctuary Films called Amazeze, which really told the story of the impact of Afrophobia, the impact of xenophobia on young children, and being able to see that situation from the eyes of children. And it's important that we find young people as well who are beacons of tolerance, beacons of unity within their communities, and being able to hold that up as an example as well. Furthermore, it's also very important part that we have dialogue with young people about this issue of all the ranging issues of isms, right? Whether that may be Afrophobia, it can be racism, it could also be homophobia, all the different isms, because beyond tolerance, we're also trying to teach people that, even in our even in our diversity, we are all still unique, we are all still powerful, and there's nothing wrong with the ways that we show up in society. So in various ways, we really do try to teach the concept of tolerance, but also unity with young people, but also being able to work together towards solutions that benefit all of us. That's really an important aspect as well, that we do in our youth clubs. And in our youth clubs, you'll find that we don't only have South African citizens. We also do have foreign nationals or migrants who form part of our youth clubs. So with us also, our policy is very much an open policy. And through that, as an example, we hope that young people understand that, our spaces are open and we should be able to interact amongst our differences.
In Parliament a couple of days ago, the president said anybody who commits crime, this was in response to a question on Afrophobia. The person who is responsible for committing crime, who attack migrants and so forth, will be arrested. But I can tell you, as somebody who's been on the ground, that I have actually seen shops being shut while the police were accompanying the people. More recently, as recently as Sunday, I had a friend coming and visit me as she was at lunchtime, as she was leaving the house. SAPS Brixton stopped her and took her, and they said they wanted her papers because she looked like she was foreign. And how do we then hold the state responsible? Because in some ways it feels like we're so powerless in that way. Eleanor, what do you think?
Yes, I am going to answer this in a kind of roundabout way. I was at the Reserve Bank, South African Reserve Bank, yesterday, attending the unveiling of a coin. There's two 2 Rand coins which have been unveiled. One to mark the 1956 March, and the other to honor Charlotte Maxeke, who in 1913, there was a women's march against past laws. And these marches were really, one of the central issues was citizenship. That's for Black South Africans to be recognized as full citizens in their own country, and not to be, the central tenet of apartheid was that Black people were not citizens. So you've had this huge mobilization of women, from 1913 through generations. And at the heart of that was a human rights cry. And these women were inclusive in their approach. And I must applaud Ahmed Kathrada Foundation for actually starting to collect the names of the 20,000 women and more that were there as part of the march. So there's many stories of fortitude, and those women that marched, many of them were women from migrant communities. And so there's a history of women fighting for the rights of everybody, fighting for the citizenship recognition as human beings, as women. And I think that that's history is what must inspire us to actually continue this fight, to say we have to counter any impulse in our society which is anti-human, which is anti-people, which results in violence and intimidation of people. South Africa has a scourge, and not only South Africa, but I think it's a global thing and it's an African thing as well. We have a scourge of gender-based violence. And if this can't be divided and isolated from a generalized violence in society. So if you say that you're going to remove violently from the society a group of people, you're going to expel them from the country, and that includes women and children, regardless of whether children are in school, that is violence. When you set an arbitrary deadline to say people must be moved by this date, and tens of thousands of people have to be moved without the proper arrangements for even if you accepted the basis that they should leave, even if that, to do it in such a humane and cruel way, setting up a deadline in the middle of winter, and that if that is not part of gender-based violence, then I don't know what is. So what I would say is that the way we must fight it is to invoke this historical tradition of women who fought for the rights of people. And fought, my colleague Nomvuyo Mzamani talks about the African child. And I would say to fight for the rights of the African child. And I don't care whether that child, what color that child is, where they come from on this continent, where their origins are, wherever on this continent, to fight for the human rights of every single African and every single African child. And to draw out, because if we honor these women and we, minting coins in their name, and at the same time removing people in violent and in cruel and inhumane ways from the country, that is very, I think, a catastrophic contradiction for our society. And it's the opposite of what we want to teach our youth.
Thank you. I am glad to see that we have been joined by development practitioner, sociologist, and political analyst, Tessa Dooms. Tessa, you have been on the ground with Siafana Sonke since June 20, when some buses came through from KZN and from Western Cape with Mozambicans, with Malawans who were being pushed out. What has the situation been like, and what could we do better? How do we stop from how do we get from, right now we reacted, obviously, but how do we go from reaction to proactive?
Yeah, so much, Sukis, and I'm sorry to everyone that I entered late. Unfortunately, my prior engagement also ran a bit late. But I'm glad that I got here in the end, towards the tail end of the remarks made by Ms. Sulu, because that is the real effect of what we're seeing in terms of what we're calling xenophobia and Afrophobia as a sentiment, has turned into a legitimized disruption and violation of people's human rights, a disruption of their lives and their livelihoods, and a violation of their human rights in a way that in this particular wave of xenophobia and xenophobic violence has become socially normalized and socially acceptable. Mm-hmm. And that was the reality that we were facing, right? We were facing a reality where, number one, because what was happening and what continues to happen in the country was being masked by March and March in particular, and the broader anti-migrant movement as this kind of peaceful protest, and all that they're doing is making legitimate asks, and all they're doing is pointing out what is wrong in society. What it didn't show was the ways in which it unlocked and unleashed direct violence, physical violence in township communities. And in a way that the state felt was acceptable, right? So in previous iterations, because it wasn't as organized as it has been in the last few months, people weren't getting, the police, approvals to have the marches. People weren't kind of, mobilizing openly. It would be these kind of sporadic things. And so somehow the state bought into this idea that as long as it's self-contained protest, they can look the other way to the rhetoric, they can look the other way to the language, they can look the other way to the intimidation. And ultimately that meant that they looked the other way and continue to look the other way to direct violence and vigilantism that is occurring in communities. And communities themselves are too afraid to speak up in many instances because it has been legitimized socially. So I think that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is that when you saw those crowds of people that were at Sherwood, when you saw the crowds of people in Cape Town and eventually the crowds of people in Pretoria and Johannesburg, I need everyone to understand that people were not leaving their homes because they saw a free ride to Malawi. That is not the way that you leave your home if you are an eight-month pregnant mother. We had to beg and convince 8-month pregnant women to not get onto a bus for a 4-day trip, even though that was the same week that they showed us on their clinic cards that they were meant to deliver. People were terrified. People were made vulnerable in ways that they were willing to jeopardize all rationality, jeopardize their safety, jeopardize giving birth on buses. There was a man who died on a bus in the last few weeks of the Malawian repatriation process, who was really quite ill, but could not be convinced to stay. Now, what kind of country are we that we have made it so that people would rather risk their lives leaving than stay for the well-being of themselves or their children? That's the country we have become. The last thing I want to say, though, is that the other thing that it did dial up for me was that the anti-migrant movements may be loud, but they are not numerous in the ways that we have been made to be imagined in society. What we saw in the response to the humanitarian crisis that unfolded was South Africans from all backgrounds, from all faiths, from all communities, from all socioeconomic standings, raising their hands and saying, number one, not in my name. And number two, Ubuntu is not suspended. And number three, I'm willing to put my own resources, time, and energy on the line because we are not going to be the kind of country that puts people at risk in the ways that what has been allowed to happen has. And it was a reminder to me, and I want to quantify this by saying when we did the maths on how much in-kind support came in a 60-day period in front of the Malawi consulate, because what people saw in front of the Malawian consulate was not this heavily funded machinery. It was something that was being driven by cash and kind, that was coming from ordinary people and NGOs. Over R1 million worth of cash and kind support came from South Africans who were rejecting the narratives, rejecting this idea that we don't care about human rights, and rejecting that people need to be treated as if they are not human on the basis of their nationality or their document status. And that's the untold story of the last few months that I think we need to focus in on. There are more of us who believe in the values of this constitution than there are of them.
Thank you for that, Tessa. You say something very important. We've had organizations like Gift of the Givers, Afrophobia Foundation, Vosika Slam over from Cape Town, and many other organizations across Kano, etc., who have been doing some work very deliberately. How do we amplify the work that these organizations have done? Because it seems this is like a failure from the media on this one.
Yeah, so I don't. Firstly, I think we need to amplify it by showing its political significance and its social significance. What I learned in this process as well, and I think it's something that I knew in the back of my mind, but it was elevated even in social justice circles, is that we treat humanitarian aid as if it is charity, not an act of political consciousness. And I think we need to start talking about humanitarian support and humanitarian aid with a lot more of an understanding that it emerges out of a sense of a political responsibility to solidarity. And I think that what has happened, that there's been a kind of an international humanitarian aid from the West that has clouded our understanding of humanitarian work, that has made humanitarian work the thing that the rich do to appease their consciences, to give crumbs to the poor. But in our context, it's not the rich giving crumbs to the poor. It's solidarity amongst oppressed people who are just experiencing that oppression differently, or people of means who understand that it is not, that their fates are tied to the marginalized. And we must have that conversation. The second thing is that we also need to be a lot more organized. I think that we are not organized in ways that give, especially to the communities that have been affected by this. The Tembelihlers, the Alexandras, the communities in KZN that have had this direct impact of the vigilantism that's been happening in their communities. That level of organization has not drawn people in, but it has also made people cower. And what they need to see is an organized mass of people who share their values, the values that they know they believe in, but are too scared to say because it is either unpopular in the moment or because it's being done by people who are carrying knopkiris and being legitimized while they do it. And so we have to organize ourselves better, that we draw society into that work on a principled basis and on the basis of what it looks like to do this work. Solidarity must be seen as an action, and an action that we do because our political consciousness demands it of us, our values demand it of us, and also something that we do to build political consciousness and give people a way to fully express the values that our constitution espouses.
Over to you, Ritabile. There are people who say you know what, we need to protect our borders. We have seen this happen in Nigeria, throwing out the Ghanaians, or Ghanaians throwing out Nigerians. We have seen this happen when Zambians had reservations about South Africans and Namibians when coal prices went down. We have seen this happen in Kenya with the Somalis and whatever. So why are we not allowed to protect our borders? Why, are we getting attacked for it? What do you say to that person?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such an interesting way you ask it, right? Because what do we mean by protecting our borders? What are we protecting them against? The idea that we need to protect ourselves against humans in itself is quite a jarring concept. And I think migration in itself is something that can be managed in a humane way. And so when we start to talk about protecting ourselves from people, I think that really takes us out of the element of centering human dignity when so-called protecting our borders. And it's important that when we do address how it is that we need to strengthen South Africa's borders, or how we need to better deal with migration in the country, we do that with the perspective of centering human dignity, as Tessa said, as Mamsusulu said as well, putting the interests of people first. Many people have had to go through very gruesome things during this time, and that has been reflective of the fact that we haven't been able to manage that with human dignity at the center. So I think it's quite important that, when we're talking about how it is that we protect it, but also how it is that we move forward, we do so with kindness and empathy. And I think the behavior that we've been seeing from South Africans, and not all South Africans, and it's important that, that Tessa has highlighted that it's not all South Africans, and in so many ways South Africans have come together to say, but this is not the South African voice, and we do need to be better organized in the way that we amplify that voice. But I think in the way that we move forward, it really does need to be not just a conversation, but a reform in policy that really speaks to Ubuntu first. Yeah.
So there's yeah, sure. You can
Could I
continue.
come in here? Yes. I want to say that this issue of protecting the borders and illegal immigration, and a lot of people have been taken in and are drawn into defending, as Tessa says, it's become almost socially legitimized because people are drawn into the thing that, oh, we can't tolerate illegal immigration. I want to say that is just a red herring, because the reality on the ground is that people who are here legally have been attacked. And they've been attacked based on their complexions. Let us not beat around the bush. This thing has been against Africans. And the blacker you are, the more you will be targeted. And that includes Black South Africans who have been stopped. You gave the example, Zuki, have been stopped. And it includes people with papers who have had their papers torn up. And these are documented cases of people who have had their papers torn up. I can say if we want an immigration management system let me put it this way, it's possible to have an immigration management system that is humane, that is firm, and that is effective. There are other countries that have done this, that are very strict on immigration, but do not, with all the protections of people, that do not violate human rights. So it's not an either or. It's not either we don't protect if we don't want to protect our borders, we must remove people violently. That is just an excuse. The other thing I want to say is that it's vulnerable people. The people who are sleeping outside the embassies being transported by buses are the most vulnerable in our society. They are not the people traffickers, they are not the drug dealers, they are not the criminals. They are the most vulnerable people in our society. And I think that we should, as far as we can, attack this notion that it is targeted against illegal people. It is targeted against Africans. There are other communities who have illegal, undocumented people amongst them. Those communities haven't been touched. Also, it's a class thing. It's attacking a particular class. Middle class people have, to a larger extent, been less vulnerable than working class and poor people.
If I can also just add into that question.
Sure.
That language matters, right? Once we move from a conversation about managing our borders to protecting our borders, we're having a different conversation about who has done the wrong thing, who has caused harm. Border mismanagement is a government failure. Right now, we need to protect our borders from incompetent government. A government that doesn't know how to manage those borders, a government that can't keep corruption away from those borders. Right now, we need to be protecting our state from the very people we've elected to look after the state. That's the problem that we have. Right now, the consequences that are always pointed out, our healthcare, we don't know how many people are in the country, our schools, we are overrun. That is a governance failure first. The biggest perpetrator in that story is a government that has failed. And those failures are not just about documentation or not documenting people. Those failures are about corruption. Those failures are about being in bed with big corporations and with businesses that benefit off having people here undocumented so that they can be exploited. Those failures are also about looting the state so that you can't build more schools, so that you can't have enough healthcare providers, whether those people are documented or not. We have a government that has failed at its responsibilities to actually live out the Constitution, the constitutional values and the laws of this country. So if we're going to protect anything, we need to protect our society and vulnerable people in it from the failures of government before we turn to anybody else.
Incidentally, I went to one of the consulates. I think it was, the Zim consulate. And I remember we had a conversation with a few of the people on the ground and who were waiting for buses to go back. And, an interesting thing emerged. One that I asked them, okay, so so did you have documentation? And they said, no. And I said, okay, so how did you come in? And they said, oh, we just paid 200 Rand at the border. Immigration officials asked us for 200 Rand. So we never seem to hold accountable, the state actors, because if you're thinking there are people at Bay Bridge, for instance, who have refused, to be promoted because of the money that they make from shaking down others. So you think about it, how many buses pass through a border? So that's one. Secondly, we have seen, and I've seen this in my neighborhood, the police going and constantly like shaking people for money. And so we never hold accountable the state's actions, but equally, we don't hold accountable corporates for their actions, because who is benefiting when the spaza shops are closed? Because we know for a fact that Pick n Pay and ShopRite and Checkers are still open. But what we also know is that they are sharing jobs left, right, and center. And that's a conversation that is never brought to the table. Who benefits when we fight?
Yes.
Maybe your comment, Rutabela, on that.
Yeah.
And all of
I
you.
think it's definitely a fundamental point that you're raising, right? Even now with the current situation with March and the aligned groups, right? We have to ask the question: what interests are they serving when they're embarking on all of this action? And I think it's a very important that as people, we begin to look at the other side. We begin to interrogate the narratives that we're being sold. I find it very interesting as well. We obviously see the effects of this current wave of Afrophobia on darker skinned Africans, but I also find it interesting that the leaders of March and March can also decide who is immune from this system that they've created, this system of those who are accepted in South Africa and those who are not accepted in South Africa. So why is it that we can go and meet with, Basotho Zamazamas and say, no, but you're welcome, you're welcome in South Africa, when those very people are known to be committing crime in South Africa, yet we tell each other that people who are not here with documentation, those people are committing crime. So I think it's very important that we question the interest when people, amplify these kinds of narratives and what it is that they're actually trying to communicate and which kind of power they're seeking.
Absolutely.
Okay, so
but I think, yeah, sure.
I want to say that if really we are serious about protecting our borders, I think Tessa made a very good point about the state. But corruption is the biggest driver of problems that our communities have. If you look at Babita Diakoran and talking about women of fortitude, I pay tribute to Babita because she was a woman who stood protecting the monies of communities and got killed for it. And that money that was stolen from Tembisa Hospital, which I didn't even know you can steal billions from a hospital. That money was clinics. That money was jobs. It was how many doctors, porters, nurses could have been employed with that money. So, and there are many others like Babita.
Zugisa's not okay. Zugisa's not okay.
Oh, she's not okay. Okay, so shall we just carry on until she maybe is overcome and comes back?
No, just carry on, Eleanor. Carry on.
Okay.
She did tell me carry on, Eleanor.
Okay. So I was talking about corruption, and corruption in South Africa and across this continent, that is what we should be targeting. If we want a well-managed immigration system, we want to, as people say, protect our borders. The border is not that physical barrier on the borders of the country. The border is the agents, the state agents that have to carry out these jobs. So if there is corruption, if people come in as a result of people trafficking, and that is one of the major issues of having people illegal here, is that there are people traffickers, and they can traffic because of corruption. How do they move large numbers of people? So even there are women at the borders who have actually left their job in border management because they are afraid of the level of corruption. So corruption is a major driver. And for me, it's been an excuse of this. Why attack people who are the victims of this? Because all poor people, in fact, all materially deprived people are the biggest victims of corruption. They are the biggest sufferers. Middle-class people in many ways can escape the consequences of corruption. But if Tembisa Hospital is not operating and you can't afford public-private health, you struggle. So I think corruption is a major issue, and that's also where we should draw the focus. And I agree totally with Tessa that the performance of the states is what is needed to protect borders, and not attacking people and violently removing them and intimidating them.
I mean, I definitely agree. And maybe something that we can also discuss, just to assist Zukiso while she's not okay, is what do we think are the kind of push factors leading to, heightened migration to the southern region, but also, as we point out, how our own government has, been responsible for a lot of the failures. Tessa mentioned that Border Management Authority. In what ways do other African states themselves as well contribute to what we're seeing across the continent? Maybe I can ask you first, Tessa, if you don't mind.
Tessa seems to have frozen. Yeah. Okay. So let me take that up. We've also just heard, and maybe Dr. Mandaza might comment, that the Zimbabwe government is started a kind of Operation Murambatsvina again, and that houses are being destroyed. People's houses are being destroyed for whatever reason. And we know that this happened in 2004. And it was a disaster for Zimbabwean people. And so for us, I think in South Africa, we have long been saying that, you need to call out governments violating the human rights of their people and forcing people to become refugees. So if people come here as refugees and asylum seekers, the issue is not to attack them and to say, go back and deal with your government. Is a very cruel and humane way of addressing the issue of a refugee or an asylum seeker. And here I want to pay tribute to Florence Nkwashu, who was a social justice activist from Soweto. When she had this issue that these migrants from Africa, from the rest of the continent, it's our job to find out what they are, why they are coming here, where they are coming from. And she actually made a trip with other South African women, one of them Sipho Mtati, who wrote about it, to find out why are Zimbabwean children coming here and what is making them come here. And she was prepared to take that up with her own government to say, don't attack these children, don't give them a hard time, but deal with those governments that are mistreating them. So I think that the blame, whether here or the people, the countries from which migrants are coming from, is that we need to respect human rights everywhere. We need to respect them here in South Africa, and we need to also have a civil society which actually pressures our government here in South Africa to say, don't be in cahoots with governments that abuse their people. Don't be in cahoots with governments that decide to extend, presidents who decide to extend their mandate through a sleight of hand rather than having an election. So you can't be in cahoots with those governments. And then when the consequence that you have a flow of migrants escaping that system, and then you kick them right back. I mean, that is the worst kind of cruelty to the vulnerable and marginalized people of our societies.
No, definitely. I completely agree with you. And I think also the point that we raised earlier about corruption within the South African system is something that we also see being very prevalent across other African nations, right? Where, you know, instead of building a hospital, we find a contractor as well who has taken the money, or a president who has, you know, cut a deal backhandedly, that also leads to people in those very countries not being able to get access or even have access at all to the services that they need. So I think I'm definitely in agreement that a large part of being able to fix the issue of, of migration or people having to leave their countries is being able to fix how people are being treated, being able to address the human rights abuses, and also being able to deal with corruption as very strictly, you know. And maybe leading from that, what do we think South Africa, what concrete action do we think South Africa should be taking, the South African government should be taking to pressurize fellow African countries to deal with the constant human rights violations that we see across the continent, the kind of starvation, famine, drought, war-ridden countries that we also see, countries that are very comfortable, with the continuation of violence within their communities. What should we be saying? What is the message that we as South Africans as well should be putting to our government to say, but you need to take a firmer hand in this, or not cooperate with such governments, or lobby to have such governments put pressure on?
I think we need a stronger civil society, Pan-African civil society. That we do have a Pan-African movement, and I think it needs to be energized, and it needs to be infused with youth. And I think the Ahmed Kathrada youth are a very good example, where I think South Africa needs a whole cadre of young people working on solidarity across Africa, working on solidarity. Palestine, we have young people working there, Cuba, so that we have developing a new cadre of activists who are respecting human rights everywhere and are prepared to take their government on issue by issue. It's hard to say like a generalized approach, but to say solidarity is important, because if you have solidarity internationally, you can have solidarity in your community and with your neighbor. And in every society, you'll have those who will participate in removing others, in being anti-migrant, and there will be those who are inclusive. And we need to work for the better part of our youth, the better part of our society. As Tessa says, we are not outnumbered, we are out-organized. So how do we organize better? And I feel that we need to build a new Pan-Africanism, or we need to infuse, not new, but infuse energy into Pan-Africanism, so that South African youth see themselves as part of the continent and I think that way they'll be better able to influence their own government.
I think that's a lovely way to put it. And I just want to come to the point that you said earlier, which is our government and lack of solidarity, because in 2020, 2021, President Ramaphosa was actually chair of the African Union when the End SARS protests were happening in Nigeria. He was also in charge when Zimbabwean Lives Matters protests were happening in Zimbabwe. And as AU chair, he didn't say anything about that. And yet the African Union did say something about, George Floyd in the US, for instance. But when they were doing it, obviously it was one of those things where it's like an attack on the American government as a right wing and whatever, but we don't speak about the evil that our own people do. So there's one. Secondly, I just wanted to touch on something that you said, Ritabile, which is, when you highlighted the stuff about Zamazamas, or the people who call Zamazamas. And, in speaking to it, it also says something to me because we will talk about Zamazamas, we'll talk about the spaza shops and stuff, but I think we're inherently anti-poor because we never ever ask, for instance, with the spaza shops, how come we can attack a Somali who owns a spaza shop, but we never question the CEO of Albany Bread who delivers daily to this alleged illegal spaza shop, or the head of like Clover Milk that delivers daily to this place, or yes, there are artisanal miners who are illegal, allegedly, well, not illegal, artisanal miners who exist, but in order for the artisanal miners to exist, there are people who are buying from them. How come we've never seen them in our courts? Why aren't we saying? Because for there to be a demand, there needs to be a supply. So perhaps we can just talk about that, even as far as employment equity is concerned, and the loss of many jobs that we've been seeing in South African corporates, not just and really something that is jarring, which is in the sugar plantations in KZN. We have seen with the Malawans that we've been engaging with that the same thing that was happening when they brought in Indians as indentured laborers is the same thing that we're seeing, with Malawans brought in. So the complicity of African governments in some of this, maybe we can talk about that.
Yeah, could I say on the issue of when you ask about corporate South Africa and the foreigners, I was walking at the height of this march on March. I was walking in a mall and I was looking at this mall and I was thinking, what is South African in this mall? What is anything that reflects African culture? And I saw this one shop which said Tsonga, it had Tsonga Leather Works or something. And I looked at this and I looked it up, and it's not owned by a Black South African. I mean, if you go into these malls, there could be anywhere. There's very little that reflects Africa. And I think that there's a whole project on how to make South Africans feel part of the continent, how to locate themselves in the continent. When you look at the Zamazamas, those people in the mines are just foot soldiers. The money, the organization is located somewhere where these marchers cannot reach. When you look at people trafficking, that brings people into the cane fields, into KZN, the machinery and the organization is located somewhere. And so if people were really serious and genuine about addressing these issues, it would be corruption and organized crime would be the first place where they should be looking at, and not attacking vulnerable people. I think I would like to refer to Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's seminal article that we mustn't be in danger of the danger of one story. And I think this has been the issue with the migrants, that it has been like one story. And this one story is that they are criminals and they are illegal. And that one story has been used to justify this kind of horrendous human rights violations that have been perpetrated on these people, and the violent removals, the attacks, the vigilantism. And yet the story of migration is really complex. And of course, there are negative parts of it. People trafficking is a crime. But the people that are trafficked are not the ones that should be attacked. So I think that the complexity of the migrant experience and situation is something which has been reduced to a very simple issue that has justified this. And how do we counter it? And one of the ways we have to counter it is through education of young people.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions, perhaps? Just wanted to highlight also that Tessa has left us because she couldn't hear. So, but are there any questions in the chats, Uncle Ibo? Let me take a look and see if there's anything. Tony, yes. Tony, I don't know whether you are able to make a comment, but is he able to make a comment, Uncle Ibo?
Yeah, I don't know. Tony's there, he's coming in.
Yeah. I think this has been devastating, and I'm sorry it's not being watched by so many people, but I wanted to raise a particular issue because I think that in every way you've raised the South African dilemma, but you've also raised the regional dilemma. The push factors, why are people coming to South Africa? What's driving them out of their countries? And many of the factors that you've talked about are operative in our own countries, in Zimbabwe and Mozambique, the failure of service delivery, the corruption, et cetera, et cetera. And I just wanted to raise one of the things about the region, and that is that SADC, almost from its beginning, put forward a protocol on migration. And I think that was far-sighted, and it was clearly in the idea that we would be a community. All of us who flowed backwards and forwards across the borders, who have affiliations across the Limpopo and across the mountains and everywhere, from Malawi down to Cape Town and all the way up to Tanzania, we are all intermixed for generations and generations. And that's why that protocol was there. And what strikes me is how, when this happens, and it's ghastly, that everybody sits back and says, well, it's a South African problem. And I'm not denying it's a South African problem, but I'm also saying this is an enormous regional problem. Why can't people do what the protocol says and go and apply to go to work in South Africa? What are all these boundaries of sovereignty and keeping people out? We are supposed to be developing a region in which people move between each other because we are brothers and sisters across the boundaries for, endless generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Tony. And I think that probably is one of the biggest problems we have, not just as South Africa, not just as SADC, but as the entire world. We sign up and ratify a lot of documents. One of the most progressive pieces of writing that we have, that we've signed and ratified, is the, and I'm trying to end this on a women perspective, is the Maputo Protocol for human and women's rights. And yet, all those rights that we've signed, our countries have signed and ratified, have not been taken care of. And nobody is pushed, and gender-based violence across the continent is still very much there. But Eleanor, you were at August 10 celebration of where we're, fitting Sibongile Mkhabela, who is the only Black woman who was imprisoned during the Soweto uprisings for her leadership. But Sibongile's parents were Mozambican, and they were considered undocumented migrants. And I've been thinking to myself quite a lot, in a world, do I want to live in a world where there's Sibongile Mkhabelas or where there Jacinta Ngobesas, and I know where I want to live in? Perhaps a last word from all of you before we go. Sorry, guys, I've been feeling unwell.
Sorry about that, Suki, and thank you for doing this, even though you feel feeling unwell. I just want to flag September the 30th as a deadline, which has been given by March on March, and that following this, we need to actually take that up with the South African government about this issue of deadlines being given by vigilante groups. I think it's really important. I think that your point, Zuki, about these protocols, we can have the protocols, but the consciousness within our societies doesn't match the sentiments of the protocols. And I think that's what we have to work with. And that's why I think organizations like Ahmed Kathrada Foundation that work with large groups of youth from working class communities are really important for our young people to have the exposure and the opportunity to work on these issues regionally. I think it's also interesting to look regionally that how immigration management is happening across the region. Because if you look at Botswana, Namibia, Eswatini, the proportion of migrants to the local population is actually higher than South Africa. And it's interesting, I mean, Botswana has managed migration very strictly and without the kind of disruptions and human rights violations that you have had here. So these are all things that we can look at. But just as much as our governments have failed us, I think SADC has failed us totally. It has failed to give a moral voice. It has failed to give direction. It has failed to take up governments on the human rights violations. And that's part of the problem, is that, we really have been failed by our institutions, regional institutions and our governments. And I think for me, I really, my hope is in strengthening civil society and in getting young people. We're facing the danger of AI, the danger of humanoid robots. These are greater dangers to us, and it's young people who are going to be impacted the most. We have Bill Gates, who is actually saying some jobs must be saved for human beings. I mean, imagine actually putting out that we have to save some jobs for human beings. So I think that we really are at a crucial moment, and it requires a greater level of organization, and it requires an energized Pan-Africanism.
Thank you so much. Ritabile, any last words?
Yeah,
How do we go?
It's important to add on to what Eleanor said about how our governments have failed us, how even regional organizations and bodies have failed us. I mean, when we talk about undocumented people, we forget how many South Africans form part of that number. And I think it's important that we look at addressing those issues as well, and looking at how it is that we build the consciousness of young people, like we said earlier, right, to understand the other side, to see the other side, to understand whose interests are being controlled, to understand where the money flows. And I think even on that, a large part of the work that we do, as Eleanor mentioned, is the conscientization of young people, being able to have these discussions, being able to build that kind of ideology within their minds. But we find that even organizations like ourselves, who are trying to empower young people in being the solution creators, not just of tomorrow, but of today as well, we don't get the funding that we need to be able to continue our work. And so even when we talk about the ways that our governments and regional bodies and African governments have failed us, we need to also talk about the lack of funding for the organizations that are doing this work on the ground every day, from the organizations you mentioned earlier, Afrophobia Aid, Gift of the Givers, ourselves as the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, the Children Literacy Foundation. It's important that if we want to create the change that we're talking about, that we invest in doing so, not just also with money, but with our time, with our voice. I mean, leading from what Tessa was saying earlier about, the voices of March and March just happen to be louder than us. We are not organized enough to be able to attack or be able to amplify our voices enough. And it's important that we put our energy there. We don't become just keyboard warriors, but we find ourselves on the street meeting organizations such as March and March, protecting our fellow man and fellow person. So yeah, I think that's also an important aspect that we have to recognize in dealing with the problems that we have around us right now.
Thank you so much, Rutabile. To Ahmed Kathrada Foundation and the SAPES Trust, thank you so much for this important conversation. Convener, do you have any last words?
Yes, a very big last word to thank you, Zuxi, and also to express immense regret. You're not well at all. You don't look well, and I'm so sorry that we had to give you this burden. But for me, the conversation was excellent. The good thing is that this is recorded, so on YouTube, and people will visit it in the subsequent days. We'll keep you informed of the numbers that come up. It's a very important conversation, and the last thing I want to say is this: that after this conversation, we feel more convinced of the need to have that conference in South Africa on migration and the impact of Afrophobia on the region, the humanitarian consequences thereof, and what should be done. And some of the conversations that you had today do point to what could be done. I'm hoping that people like Eleanor and yourselves can put up a panel discussion. We hope to have the conference in Pretoria